Today, we're going to begin looking at a speech given by Jeando Masoero, the creator of the initial Alexander technique, to an audience of Alexander technique teachers in 2014. I think this speech contains a lot of extremely valuable information that can give us a solid basis for understanding how the human postural system really works. I'll link a PDF of this speech in the description if you'd like to read it yourself, and it does include some pictures and footnotes that make it quite a dense and rewarding read. It may be a little technical for the average person and was aimed at an Alexander technique audience, so it's not necessarily the easiest read if you're quite unfamiliar with the subject. I intend to bring you some simple explanations of the important information that is contained in the speech, which is entitled A Technique for Learning to Think to Develop Intelligent Physical Behavior. To me, one of the most interesting claims in the speech is about the basic conception of muscular contraction. He says, "In all academic textbooks steeped in the neuromuscular model, contraction is the idea that the activated muscle will exert a force and shorten, producing a mechanical effect on the skeletal segments it is attached to, thereby bringing them closer together." This is an idea we are likely familiar with. When a muscle contracts, it shortens and moves the bony structures it's connected to closer together. This idea, however, is not the full picture. In the new neuromusculoskeletal model, the muscular mechanism is not seen in isolation from the bones and the skeletal adjustment. When a nervous impulse reaches the muscle, there is a contraction. The muscle will produce a force that potentially could make it shorten, but, and it is a major qualifier, the effective result of that contraction cannot be detached from what will be the direction of the action of the skeleton on the contracting muscle. What the old model is missing is the effect of the skeletal system and our ability to direct our skeletal system using our conscious mind. Of course, a muscular contraction can cause a muscle to shorten, but Masoero lays out 3 types of muscular contraction that are possible. 1. A shortening contraction. If the forces transmitted by the skeleton are smaller than the force of the muscle will shorten and bring the parts of the skeleton it's connected to closer together. Or, if the force of the skeleton is in the same direction as the force of the muscle, you'll get the same result. For instance, the latissimus dorsi connects from the top of the back of the pelvis to the upper arm. If you engage your latissimus dorsi in a shortening contraction, the muscle will shorten and the arm will move back and down and closer to the body. Not only will the arm move back towards the pelvis, but the back of the pelvis will move forward and up towards the arms. Or you can guarantee a shortening contraction of the latissimus dorsi if you intentionally move your arm back and the back of your pelvis forward while contracting your latissimus dorsi. 2. An isometric contraction. If the forces transmitted by the skeleton are equal to the force of the muscle will not change in size, and the parts of the skeleton the muscle is connected to will not move. To return to our example, if you engage your latissimus dorsi, but you do not allow the arm to be pulled back and in towards the body, nor do you allow the top of the back of the pelvis to go forward and up, the muscle will be engaged but will not shorten. And since the arm and pelvis are not moving, the parts of the skeleton will not be moving closer together. 3. A lengthening contraction. If the forces transmitted by the skeleton are greater than the force of the muscle and are in the opposing direction to the force of the muscle, you can cause the muscle to lengthen while you're contracting it. In such a contraction, the parts of the skeleton that the muscle is connected to will move apart during the contraction. So if you engage your latissimus dorsi while consciously moving your upper arm forward and out and the back of your pelvis back and down, the muscle will be lengthening as it contracts. The difference between a shortening contraction, an isometric contraction, and a lengthening contraction is how you move or refuse to move your skeleton during the muscular contraction. So we can control whether we shorten or lengthen our muscles in activity by using our conscious mind to decide how we will move or not move parts of our skeletal system during the activity. People in the exercise world are using lengthening contractions more and more, typically calling them eccentric contractions. but frequently, eccentric contractions are viewed in conjunction with concentric contractions or shortening contractions. A common example is that the first part of a bicep curl is the shortening contraction, and if the weight is not dropped but instead moved down in a controlled way, that will be the lengthening contraction. But we are not looking to get lengthening contractions in one muscle as part of a specific exercise, or simply to get stronger. We want to maintain lengthening contractions all the time, so that our body stays lengthened and appropriately widened. For instance, if you habitually keep your arm pulled back and the top of the back of your pelvis pressed forward, as most people do, you are maintaining your latissimus dorsi in a shortened state. Whereas, if you keep your upper arm forward of your torso and the back of your pelvis back and down, you will maintain your latissimus dorsi in a lengthened state. The difference, again, is how you orient and direct your skeletal segments. And skeletal segments just means parts of your skeleton. We want all the muscles of the body, and particularly the torso, to be appropriately lengthened during all activity. Lengthening contractions, for us, are not an exercise. They are the general condition that we want to maintain in our muscular system. Despite the increasing use of eccentric contractions in exercise and physical therapy settings, if you look at virtually any exercise or medical presentation, most muscles, including the latissimus dorsi, will be depicted in their shortened state and not their lengthened state. I do want to be clear, however, that from Masoero's perspective, lengthening the fascia is much more fundamental to maintaining the torso in its full length and width than lengthening muscles. But irrational shortening contractions in the muscular system can cause problems for our fascia, so they do also need to be considered. If the geometry of the skeletal segments could be consciously ordered so as to use the load of each part and the passive external forces acting on the skeleton in order to oppose the direction of shortening of the muscular contractions, then the subject would have at his disposition a treasure of highly efficient forces and the responsiveness of an elastic structure. In view of the nature of the geometry of the human structure, it is clear that the resulting lengthening contractions, or antagonistic pulls, would be maximum when the stature or skeletal chain is maximally lengthening, the exact condition of coordinated support that we have studied. While these contractions would use a lot less energy than the shortening contractions of the habitual reaction, they would be ideal to resist elastically an imposed load, freeing the joints, and to adapt dynamically to control the displacement of a load. Lengthening contractions are understood to generate more force with less energy input. Though muscles are not the same as fascia, just like with fascia, muscles will have increased elastic resistance when they're lengthened as opposed to shortened. The connective tissues that muscles are connected to will also be lengthened when the muscles are lengthened, so they too will be better able to provide proper elastic resistance. That extra resistance is of great benefit, and Masoero lays out how we get there. We need to consciously direct our skeleton in opposition to the muscular contraction, which would otherwise shorten the muscle and bring the parts of the skeleton that the muscle is connected to closer together. Masoero says, "For a long time, the scientifically accepted reductionist model of human motor control was the neuromuscular model. According to that model, it was believed A. that the brain effectively stores motor programs of postural reaction in the form of a melody of effectors' impulsions directed toward the musculature, and B. that the muscles would generate movement and also break and stop movement by the same agency, i.e., by exerting forces through a shortening contraction, no other forces being thought necessary to stabilize the human frame. The belief sustaining this model was that the muscular system and the skeleton were totally subservient to the nervous impulses coming from the motor systems in the brain, and that motor coordination was a specific area dealt with by the localized brain system called the motor region. This idea that motor coordination is the result of only the subconscious motor region of the brain is wrong. The conscious mind is hugely important in general motor control, and if it's left out, you're at the mercy of irrational habits. We can turn a shortening contraction into a lengthening contraction by applying our conscious mind to our skeleton. We can decide, I will not allow my arm to be pulled back, even while engaging muscles that, by the old neuromuscular model, should inherently pull our arm back. But we can only do that if we apply our conscious mind. Of course, the people who came to the idea that muscular contractions inherently shorten weren't dummies. When muscular contractions are not opposed by the weight of a load, they will result in shortening. However, we know that the weight of the skeleton can serve as the load that opposes shortening during a muscular contraction, if we consciously direct our skeletal segments in the correct way. But if you don't understand that, you will assume muscular contractions inherently shorten. This is the trouble when you're missing a fundamental piece of the puzzle. The assumptions you build from that incomplete understanding will not just be wrong, they will sabotage your further inquiry. The shortening that is observable during most people's muscular contractions is due to the fact that they're not directing their skeletal segments properly. Masoero quotes from a paper entitled Postural Perturbations, New Insights for Treatment of Balance Disorders, that says, recent studies of responses to postural perturbations have provided new views of how postural stability is controlled. Previously, balance was viewed as resulting from a distinct set of reflex-like equilibrium responses elicited by stimuli to a particular sensory system and neural balance center. More recently, balance has been viewed as a skill that the nervous system learns to accomplish using many systems, including passive biomechanical elements, all available sensory systems and muscles, and many different parts of the brain. We believe that balance can no longer be viewed as a totally reactive response to sensory stimuli. Instead, results from platform studies have shown that equilibrium control is quite proactive, adaptive, and centrally organized based on prior experience and intention. The outdated model says that we maintain equilibrium through reflex-like responses that are produced by our subconscious mind in a specific part of the brain. The new model recognizes that maintaining equilibrium is a proactive and adaptive process that involves the entire brain, including our higher cognitive functions. To give an example of using our higher cognitive functions, we can change our performance of a routine activity by taking our understanding of a simple geometric model and applying it to our body during the activity. People often see bad posture as a physical issue, but it's just as much mental as it is physical. To get lasting and genuinely beneficial changes in the condition of our body, we need to make changes in our thinking. Quoting again from Masoero, "Motus perendo vincitur, movement is conquered by obedience," is the motto chosen by N.A. Bernstein, one of the greatest thinkers of biomechanics, to capture the idea that the fundamental problem our brain has to deal with is to adapt to an ever-changing motor field and to use active muscle force only in the capacity of complementary forces. He made it clear that it is impossible that a fixed neuromuscular program, a postural reflex, could represent an adaptive postural reaction. To be able to truly adapt to novel and complex postural stimulation, we need to use our whole mind. It has been demonstrated that the whole brain and the higher mental functions are involved in the creation of adaptable reactions to postural threats, and are essential to the construction of dexterous movement, particularly in case of unexpected events for which the organism has had no training. Even in so-called instinctive reaction, such as fast postural reaction to perturbation, it has been shown repeatedly that the low-level motor activation, postural tone, necessary for maintaining postural orientation and postural equilibrium is in no way independent of, but, on the contrary, highly dependent on, the cognitive higher functions, decisional attention, mental calculation, and working memory. A quick walk in a psychiatric hospital should suffice to convince anyone that the motor problem requires global thinking, and that global thinking cannot thrive without correct means to plan solutions to the motor problem. As Masoero says, even our quick responses to surprising threats to our equilibrium, which are often thought to be reflexive, can be significantly changed. And this is because our postural reactions are quite dependent on our ability to rationally control and direct our body and its movements. Masoero's conclusion on this point. People do not learn invariant motor programs which are stored in the motor system. Rather, by using more or less their whole brain, and particularly the higher mental functions, they come to different solutions to different motor problems. Very often, these solutions, involving representation of the problem, strategies of balance, understanding the experience of wrong use, are automatized at a very low level of cognitive ability, and constitute a real danger for the individual's functioning and dexterity. The problem is the level at which automatization is taking place. Proposing to establish an automatization of a so-called natural motor program is certainly not the solution for our pupil. It is really part of the essence of the problem, the lack of use of the higher mental functions in the guidance of the postural reaction. We cannot expect that if we merely strengthen and stretch the right muscles, that then our subconscious motor system will use those muscles in the correct way and solve our postural problems for us. We do not possess correct responses to equilibrium challenges that are ready to be automatically spit out. We have to solve challenges to our equilibrium the way we solve other problems, by using our reason and applying our whole mind. Creativity, as the capacity to solve new and evolving problems, is a product of the use of reasoning with concepts, reasoning at the highest level. It is very important to insist on that point. Reasoning to direct and control one's activity is not an innate talent. It rests on the learned capacity to plan and organize psychophysical behavior, with speech as a functional tool. People often want to know when their body will just automatically have good posture, but maintaining your equilibrium in ever-changing circumstances isn't done automatically. It's done creatively, using reason. Postural interventions that do not bring your higher cognitive functions into play will not lead to long-term results, because the crux of the problem is the very fact that people are not using their higher mental functions to guide their postural reactions. Now, I can see how this might sound a little intimidating, but this does not mean you need to be conventionally smart to have good posture. In fact, many highly educated people have horrific posture. The problem is not that people are too dumb to apply their rational mind to their movements, it's that they've never been taught how, and thus do not know how. It's like trying to solve a math problem when you've never been taught math. Your solutions are going to be incorrect and irrational, and incorrect solutions in the body appear as postural dysfunction and pain. As Masoero puts it, the Alexander technique is education. It is remedial work. It is intended for students that are experiencing learning difficulties because of the automatization of their motor solutions. Nearly everyone in modern civilization, whether highly educated or quite the opposite, is experiencing learning difficulties in this sphere of postural regulation. Most people, even highly athletic people, cannot at first follow rather simple directions for postural adjustments because they don't know how to apply their conscious mind rationally to motor problems. They instead have automatized their solutions to such problems at a subconscious and largely irrational level, and as a result, they experience glaring postural problems that often eventually result in poor performance or pain. To bring your conscious, reasoning mind into action, you need a system or a technique for learning to think, to develop intelligent physical behavior, if you will. For that, my recommendation is the Initial Alexander technique. Initial Alexander technique lessons are designed to bring one's higher cognitive functions into play, to succeed in solving increasingly complex postural problem-solving games. Your skill in overcoming these equilibrium challenges will increase because your understanding of how to direct the movements of the parts of your body will improve, and you will learn to recognize, understand, and then outsmart your postural problems. As your skill increases, the problem-solving games that your teacher will present to you will become more difficult. Soon enough, an activity that it once seemed impossible to maintain your balance during will pose very little threat to your equilibrium, because you will know how to rationally direct your motor system so as to adapt to such a threat. In a sense, initial Alexander technique lessons teach very basic skills that most people in modern civilization need only because we've never developed our ability to consciously guide our physical activity, and have instead relied on automatized responses that, as I've said, are largely irrational. And the irrationality of those responses is evident in the poor postural condition of basically everyone in modern civilization. These general basic skills that are learned in initial Alexander technique lessons can be applied everywhere in your life, whether it's something simple like bending down to pick something up or sitting into a chair, or something more complex like playing a violin or giving a speech. As Masoero, the creator of the initial Alexander technique, said, this is remedial work, but it opens up a whole realm of possibilities when one is no longer hindered by such basic functional motor problems. More information on how to get lessons in the initial Alexander technique, which are done one-on-one over Zoom, will be in the description. Thanks for joining me again today. Questions and comments are always welcome in the comment section below.